Alonso, and I'm speaking on behalf of Peace TV. We're here at the International Peace Institute to discuss the high risks of delivery and enabling operation and risk mandates into countries that have no access to a lot of things like security, staff, medical staff, access and coordination, and we just heard from the speakers a little bit of what the recommendations are, and we're going to hear more about in this panel. Thank you.
Allow me to take this opportunity to thank our partners at the Permanent Mission of Sweden for the support for this project and beyond. The United Nations development, humanitarian, human rights, and peace and security work depends on its over 500 field presences across more than 130 countries. Whether providing life-saving assistance in Syria, conducting peacekeeping patrols in the Central African Republic, or enabling government work in Somalia, each field presence requires multiple enabling functions in order for the UN and its partners to deliver on their substantive mandates. These functions are diverse and complex and include such things as risk management, physical security, staff welfare, logistics and transportation, medical response, communications and access. And these are often the forgotten parents of success. Indeed, establishing and maintaining these functions, particularly in remote locations with limited infrastructure, are an underappreciated, underexplained, and often daunting task for the UN. Although actually I look at this crowd and I wonder how underappreciated it is. Clearly everyone here is very aware of this issue. Beyond just the enabling functions, UN-led operations in crisis and conflict-affected settings always involve choices and trade-offs among an array of risky options. While prioritizing substantive mandates may be straightforward from a headquarters perspective, UN field staff are often forced to make rapid decisions on urgent, complex issues that offer no easy solutions. And I believe we will hear examples of some of these from our very experienced panelists in a moment. As the planned UN reforms barrel ahead to their January start date, questions of managing this complexity and enabling effective delivery, and doing so in a cost-effective and financially sustainable manner, become all the more pressing. So we hope that today's policy forum will help to advance this conversation in three ways. First, by highlighting the functions and costs required to operate UN field presences in high-risk environments, with examples from the UN's work in countries like Somalia and Central African Republic. Second, by examining the trade-offs inherent to these functions and costs and unpacking through some concrete examples how such dynamics impact mandate delivery. And finally, by informing policy discussions about how these dynamics and trade-offs impact the UN's role in diverse and complex operational environments. These are ambitious goals to cover in just an hour and a half, but we have a great panel here to help us do all of that. We have Mark Chakond, Advisor, UN Executive Office of the Secretary General, Ms. Nanette Ahmed, Director and Team Leader of the Central Africa Integrated Operational Team at UNPKO, and Mr. Aurelian Hoefler, Chief of the Policy, Advice, and Planning Section, UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. You have full biographies in your programs. After the panel, we will have a Q&A, and then following that, we'll have closing remarks by Her Excellency Ms. Irina Shulgin-Noni, Deputy Permanent Representative of Permanent Mission Sweden to the United Nations. So we have a very full program, but we do have a lot to talk about. So I'll start by inviting Mark to the podium to deliver his presentation from here. It's a visual presentation. After that, we'll come up to the panel and begin the panel discussion. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to IPI really for organizing this. For some of us, we really appreciate the work that IPI does on some of these operational issues because, as you said, Adam, sometimes they're the forgotten parent. Especially in New York, we like to talk grand strategy and forget, the engine room side of things that need to happen in order for these strategies to be achieved. I also want to thank the mission of Sweden for supporting this, and it's not a surprise actually because for me this conversation, this piece of work on the costs of mandate delivery started in Somalia. A couple of years ago when we were thinking about the UN's posture in Somalia, we were getting signals from the member states that we should get more out there, we should be in the regions, more field presence, get out there, get out there, get out there. And at the same time, we were under significant security threats requiring us to do, to build more bunkers and so forth. And at the same time, we were struggling to fund our coordination work, our RC office, our risk management unit. And then some of us thought, okay, something's off here. We're not connecting the dots between the ends, our strategies, and some of these functions that are absolutely critical if we're going to achieve that strategy. And so we started a dialogue with member states, and it was under the leadership of then Ambassador Mikael Lindvall, to really connect these different elements, connect the dots. And it's also not a surprise that it was Sweden because it was actually one of the few delegations that had a field presence and understood that if you want to get out to see the government, you need ADs. If you need a field presence somewhere, you're going to have to invest in security. So again, thanks to the mission of Sweden for supporting this effort, in Somalia and globally. And it's great that this conversation is going global. So I just have a few slides just to frame some of the issues, set the context, and then my colleagues from DPO and OCHA will deep dive and give you specific examples. But it all starts with context. Now, by the way, what we want to talk about today is not just about peacekeeping. It is about peacekeeping, but it applies to humanitarian interventions, development work. But the couple of slides that I have talk about peacekeeping as a proxy. If you look, first of all, where in these crisis contexts, most of them are increasingly remote, landlocked. 63% of peacekeeping personnel authorized for landlocked or hard-to-reach areas, and probably this therefore applies to humanitarian colleagues who work in the same settings. So these are just, in terms of logistics and transports, you need flights, you need cars, you need a number of things to just be there and get out there. These are also settings, again, using peacekeeping locations as a proxy, where doing business is difficult in terms of importing stuff, importing goods. Cost of doing business is extremely high. Number 3, in the interest of time, I'll go fairly quickly, but you get the point. Just on corruption, if you look at the World Bank Index, these are also contexts that enable corruption. And I want to make a very clear point here. In these places, corruption comes from everywhere. It comes from the international community, comes from the UN, comes from governments, comes from international NGOs, comes from local NGOs. We're all part of it. If you look at the Transparency International reports, it's very clear. So when we talk about corruption in these countries, it applies to all of the actors involved in the response. It's just because the circumstances there, the nature of the work, creates opportunities for that. So this is something also that's very specific to these types of contexts. Also wanted to highlight that for UN personnel, but I would assume, I don't have the numbers, that it's the same for international delegations, local partners, NGOs. Challenges to staff welfare are significant if you compare it to what happens to our staff and our colleagues in non-risky or complex environments. And we're getting more and more numbers. And the UN recently, the senior management group, chaired by the Secretary General, had a discussion on mental health. And we know that in these environments, it's a challenge. These are difficult operating environments. Give you an example for Somalia in terms of the access. When we map out our access, this is what it looks like. And this was back a few years ago when access in Somaliland was fairly open, and things have changed since then. But access in these places defined by, and access can be restricted by security, by logistics, a number of factors, but access is extremely restricted. So in order to deal with to operate in these environments, we need a number of what we call enabling functions. These are things that they're not necessarily visible, but they need to be in place, they need to be undertaken in order to be able to deliver on your DDR mandate, your SSR mandate, your humanitarian mandate, your development mandate. Obviously, you need security. You need logistics, operations, flights, cars, and so forth. Staff welfare and medical. When you have staff in these locations, you need medical support, you need psychological support, you need to get them out every 4 weeks. That has a cost, or every 6 weeks, depending on the security situation. You need risk management, and that applies to a number of risks, notably fiduciary risk. If you're going to be spending money on humanitarian delivery, you need to know who your partners are. You need to know how solid they are if you're going to transfer resources. You need access, and Aurélien will speak more to it, especially in the context of humanitarian access, but you need people whose job it is really to make sure that you talk to certain people so that trucks can get through, or you talk to certain people so that some obstacles can be removed. And you need coordination. You have a number of players involved within the UN, but more broadly, in terms of the international community, you need people to actually bring everybody together and pursue common objectives. A couple of things. One, again, as I mentioned, this applies to peacekeeping. These are functions that are needed for peacekeeping mandates, peace building, development, humanitarian. They apply across the range of UN mandates. Number two, they're not just for the UN. A number of these functions allow other partners to operate, including international delegations. On the security side, in a place such as Somalia, some international delegations could not fly into Mogadishu or travel across Somalia if the UN didn't provide the security. Or the medical teams in place in some remote locations. And they also enable government to function. And Nanette has a long experience with making sure that there are assets made available to governments to fly to other cities across their countries. So you want to think of them as public goods in a way for more than for the UN and beyond. Now they all come at a cost, and we haven't been very good at explaining those costs to member states, to donors. Let me give you one quick example. If you look at security enablers in Somalia, things again that don't necessarily appear visible, but you need to pay for these things in order to be able to deliver on your mandates. Emergency response teams in 5 locations across Somalia, that's $1.2 million. Without these people in place, and that's really just a doctor and a couple of nurses, but the UN cannot be there, and other international actors cannot be there. Protected mobility, AVs, vehicles. You need them to drive around, to take delegations from the UN compound to the government compound. That's the budget at the time was 1.5 million a year, including maintenance, of course, because things happen to these vehicles. The security aircraft that our Department of Security uses to get out there to see if it's safe for humanitarian actors to go in to deliver assistance, or to send a delegation to visit local leaders. That's 1.2 million a year. And then having security officers across some of these places, 1 million a year. And the What Is Your Security project was really just to secure the road from the airport to other UN locations, checkpoints and so forth. And again, this is a road that's used by a number of other actors. So I apologize, I'm taking you a little bit into the engine room, but that's the reality. That's what needs to be factored into mission budgets and or agency budgets. But the reality is, we haven't been very good at explaining all of these enabling functions, what they cost and why they're needed. Because it's complex. If you look at the security side, the way the UN funds its security architecture is very complex. Most people within the UN don't understand it. So we need to be a lot better at explaining how these things work, how they're funded. I think also some people don't want to bother knowing these issues, because this is the engine room. This is deep in the engine room. They'd rather sit somewhere and think grand strategy. But if we define strategy as aligning means to the ends, we've got to factor in that data. A few more observations, and then I'll end there. They need to be better understood obviously by the UN, but more importantly, by member states and donors because they're tied to the expectations that member states have of the UN. If member states want the UN, their partners, to be out in the field in remote locations, and come with security costs. If member states want zero corruption, zero fraud in the money that they're giving to the UN to disperse to NGOs or other partners for humanitarian relief or development work, you need to invest in risk management. For an organization like FAO, 6% of project costs are tied to their risk management procedures in some of these contexts because they have call centers to verify if the money has reached the beneficiaries, there are third-party monitoring that are being used. All of these things have a cost. The second observation is that they're also tied to trade-offs. In these environments, if you reduce a risk somewhere, chances are costs and risks are going to pop up somewhere else. So if you want to reduce security costs and security risk by having fewer people in remote locations, it's fine. You're just going to increase fiduciary risks because you have fewer eyes and ears on the ground to see where the money's going. These are difficult trade-offs. If you reduce security costs, you also have increased reputational costs to the UN, and obviously costs in terms of human life. So these trade-offs are real, and they just need to be articulated and understood. But these realities also help, at least us within the UN, think about new business models. It's not a question of give us some more money. Sometimes it is about we need more money. But it's also forcing us at the UN, and not just within the context of UN reform, but more generally, to think about new business models to manage these trade-offs and address these costs. So we're talking use of new technology, we're talking about consolidation of assets. There are a number of ideas that are currently being implemented across the world in different locations to manage in terms of business models, strengthening existing ones or developing new ones to manage these realities. But I would end by also saying that there's a limit to efficiency gains. There's a lot the UN can and should be doing in terms of new business models to address these realities in the field, but at one point you hit a wall. There's a limit to how much you can cut costs on security and so forth until you start raising other costs and risks. So yes, this is certainly, this type of dialogue, this type of work is really pushing some of us within the UN to think through new business models and think in terms of efficiency, but that's only part of the equation, and we welcome this dialogue with you to really understand the trade-offs and some of the difficult options. Unfortunately, in these environments, it's always a choice between, for lack of a better word, suboptimal choices, but they need to be discussed collectively. So I'll end there again, thanking you, thanking IPI and the Swedish Mission. For us, this is the type of discussion that connects different levels. So to us, this is strategy making when we connect these different levels. And these are some of the discussion that can then inform mandate definition. They can inform policy decisions that are made here at capital level. They can inform budgetary discussions in the Fifth Committee, the ACBQ, or donor capitals. So we hope that through this dialogue, a number of good things can happen. Thank you again for this, and I'll hand it back to Adam.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. That was really incredibly clear and concise. I think that to me the key issue is the need to understand what it takes to achieve success, and the fine detail behind that. We were chatting before about this sort of project makes me think about any kind of project management at a most mundane level. You want to do things quickly at the highest quality possible and as most cost effective as possible, and you can do things fast and cheap, but that's probably not going to be top quality. You can do things fast and top quality, but that's going to cost you. But you can't do things fast, top quality, and cheap. Something that all managers come to. There are trade-offs, and I think when you add to this the complexity of a conflict zone, and on this equation, really the stakes get quite high because of lives are at stake. And so it's something that really needs to be thought of really concretely and strategically. So thank you for that excellent presentation. Much appreciated. We will now move on to our panel discussion with Lynette. Please, yours.
Thank you. Thanks to IPI and for government of Sweden. It's a real honor to be here. And I also, I have to say that I really am here on behalf of our colleagues in the field, our colleagues in the Central African Republic, who face these trade-offs and these challenges and what it means for the lives of peacekeepers and the lives of the civilians that they're protecting on a daily basis. So I have to say that, this is really for them and to try to bring their story here to you in some concrete fashion. Mark is always a tough act to follow. I will do my best, but he's really covered all the issues and all the policy issues. And but for peacekeeping, as you know, by and large, we deploy in very challenging post-conflict situations, sometimes continuing conflict situations, and more we're deploying into contexts that are extremely inhospitable, whether logistically or security-wise, very dangerous, complex, where a political process is non-existent, stalling, etc., which makes it all the more complicated for us to achieve our objectives. Therefore, as Mark was saying, risk management is a daily, if not an hourly, endeavor by the mission leadership, by a patrol on the ground. Do they go forward? Do they not go forward? Do they go out of a camp to protect some civilians that are being attacked when they themselves are being attacked? So it's on a daily basis, and you have to balance the priorities. For example, Kazakh. Okay, we all have the ideal of the 10-1-2 timeline, which, however, in a location like the Central African Republic, which is a rather large country, we have a small, what could be seen as a small footprint if you balance it against the needs of civilians, but it could be seen as a rather large footprint when you don't have the Kazakh ability in order to reach all those locations in the time that's required. So you have to balance it. How many forward operating bases do you deploy in order to protect civilians? Versus, how far overstretched are you from being able to deliver the kind of medical care that is required? So those are the trade-offs and the balances, and it's difficult to always provide, and then it makes it difficult to attract the right quality of people, of course, and it also compromises the safety and security of all personnel, including uniformed personnel on the ground. And sometimes you have to think about how much risk is worth it. I'm going back to thinking about Cote d'Ivoire, this is some years ago, and seeing where these discussions about, with the ongoing fighting, should we stay or should we go? And it was decided that the strategic objective was so great that we stayed. It did not come free of charge. It came with a price. And so I think the bottom line is that if you're going to operate and deliver on your mandate in high-risk environments, it comes at a cost. I think that's been stressed by both Mark and Adam. And you can't nickel and dime it, frankly. I know that sometimes you look at these operations and you're going, my God, they're expensive. But if you look at actually what they're paying for and really go down deep, and I think you can see that a lot of these areas are the ones that you need in order to even be there in the first place and to be effective, which is the most important. Because just being somewhere without being able to be effective is not achieving anyone's goal or objective. And I think we are, and we have been exploring new business models and assessing existing ones, and that's a large part of what the SG's reforms, are about. And looking at the UN rules and regulations, how can we make them work better? And I think that's the action for peacekeeping is a large part of it for peacekeeping. And if I may point to the Declaration of Shared Commitments, because it's not just about us or the Secretariat or the peacekeeping operation alone. We're all in this together. And we cannot separate ourselves, and that's why we have our respective roles and responsibilities, and coming together to deliver is the most important. But you are faced with stark choices on how to do it. We want to have a more flexible and mobile military concept in the Central African Republic. We want to have community liaison officers deployed really deep into the communities to work with them and to better understand the dynamics. And then to do this, we have to deploy our offices in some of the most hostile, complex, volatile locations. There are some offices or locations we cannot reach by road 6 months of the year. You know, our supply chain from the port in Cameroon gets cut off. We have no capacity in order to fly in the resources required because the airport in Bangui can't handle really large logistical loads. So those are has to balance, and what we here have to support them. But I think, as I mentioned, some of the reforms will be helpful. It's going to put, for example, authority for procurement where authority for delivery lies, in the field. We're working with our TCCs and PCCs to look at COE and how to address, the capabilities required to operate with the mobile flexible force. So I think we are going forward, but we've got a long way to go. For example, repairing roads. It's not a responsibility of a peacekeeping operation, it's a responsibility of the government, but if we don't have good roads, for example, like the supply line, we can't use the roads to supply our troops. So whose responsibility is it? And at what timeline do you need it by? So there's a lot of trade-offs. So we have to do more with less, we have to do less with less, but we're given complex mandates, many pages long, giving new tasks without additional resources, having to prioritize. It comes with trade-offs. It comes with trade-offs in terms of, can we support a needed humanitarian mission to help solve this unknown disease that's killing children? Yes, that's important. So we will do that trade-off. We will help our humanitarians to do it. Do we need, what if the government, as Mark was mentioning, needs to reach out to the constituency? The president has to engage with some groups that are on the periphery and that have been marginalized. And maybe that comes at a cost of a flight not picking up some colleagues who need to go on R&R after they've been in a horrible location for 8 weeks. Yes, we do it because that in the end is what will take us to delivery on our mandate and overall objective. But I think everybody realizes that it comes with cost, but I think sometimes you don't see the stark costs that are associated with it. So I think that, if I may say that, one of some of the great success stories are when we work together. And I want to just point to one was supporting the return of the IDPs in FAO. And sometimes you think, oh, why are you supporting the return of IDPs? That's not your responsibility. But actually, it's a stabilizing factor. It stabilizes the area. Having people live where they are actually helps the political process. It helps decrease the control of armed groups over a community. And it enables you then to proceed substantively. So sometimes maybe when you see why are they making that choice, there is a reason behind it. And so, as I said, my full respect to our colleagues on the ground who do this on a daily basis. I have to say that sometimes maybe the trade-offs don't come in the direction that peacekeeping they would like. Like we maybe need our development colleagues in order to deliver a peace dividend in a very insecure location, but they feel that they can't do it because the situation is too insecure. And so those are some of the debates that we have to have with our development partners. It's the classic chicken and the egg. But if I could just close by saying that we're all in this together, and not just on the ground in the field, it's also here. And I think Mark was absolutely correct when he says bringing together the political, the operational, and the resources required is essential. And it's essential that we have a dialogue about how we can do that better and to manage the trade-offs so that they're more on the positive side than on the negative side. Thank you.
Great, I think that central message of that we're all in this together, and it's all parts of the system working together, which is the best cases for success. It strikes me, I was struck by your comment, Mark, about the public good, that this is a public good, and that because when these enabling functions are not just for peacekeeping, they're for the broader UN system, but they're even for the delegations, the people. IPI, when we go and do research in the country where UN is, we depend upon the UN security team. We depend upon UN transport and such. And so I think that message of this is a collective endeavor is a really good and important one. Thank you very much. And thank you for the concrete example. I love this example about the repairing of the roads. Honestly, I don't think about that. But it's essentially important to deliver on the mandates. You need to have that. So thank you. I really appreciate that. All right.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you to IPI and to the Swedish government for convening this discussion. I'm going to focus exclusively on the humanitarian side and try to be as concrete as possible in explaining how we operate and what kind of enabling functions we need and some of the trade-offs we're facing. But just to put this into context, a couple of days ago we launched our appeals for 2019. So next year, humanitarian partners are going to assist, hopefully, about 94 million people for a cost of about $22 billion. And if you look at where this money will be spent, and I look at the list yesterday of the 31 countries for which we're putting money, all of them are either active armed conflicts or complex emergencies. And I'm saying that because I think we need to realize that this is the normal for humanitarians today, to operate in this really highly insecure environment. Somalia, South Sudan, Syria and Sudan alone captured about 55% of all resources, humanitarian resources between 2014 and 2018. So it's really this high-risk environment that really take a lot of our money, and is due, of course, to the amount of needs, but also to the kind of setup we need to put in place in order to operate in this environment. So, and I'm going to focus on two issues in particular. The first one is how we get access in this environment. I mean, especially in New York, and especially having worked on Syria, access seems to be on everyone's lips, and asking humanitarians, why don't you have access, and what's happening? But what does it mean concretely, gaining access? What kind of setup you need to put in place? Access first is having the right understanding of what is the situation and understanding the context in which you operate. It means like having staff dedicated to actually leading analysis of the context in which you want to respond, and communicate with communities involved and parties to conflict, including armed groups. This takes time, this takes skills, and of course this takes money, but it is absolutely necessary. It's about establishing field offices in very remote locations, it's having staff drinking coffees for weeks, sometimes without concrete results, but just to build this relationship and hopefully deliver assistance. It's about liaising with the military. Having staff who have the expertise to really translate to the military what we mean we humanitarians, and then translate it back to us humanitarians what the military wants. So for instance, in Yemen today, in order to deliver in Yemen, we had to establish a back office in Riyadh with civil military coordination officers whose sole job is to liaise with the coalition's military and make sure that we understand each other and that we work on deconfliction arrangement. That again is something which is time-consuming and resource-consuming. Safety, logistic, you mentioned it to some extent. This is also a challenge we face. I mean, most of these environments are not made to travel rapidly or to deliver rapidly. Sometimes we're lucky enough to have the mission help us, but in many environments we don't have a mission. In Yemen today, WFP has to operate an entire fleet of planes just for us to be able to reach different locations in Yemen. In Sri Lanka, remember, we needed to build bomb shelters in each house or for each staff because these are risks in the environment. So that's for the access and the complexity of the setup you need to have in an office to lead some access discussion. The second point, which is increasing, is the resources needed to manage some of the fiduciary risks, including some related to some of the counterterrorism measures or policies of member states and the UN. If you look at the context I mentioned in the opening, in all of them you have UN sanctions regime, or member state sanction regime, or counterterrorism operation ongoing. And of course our donors ask us to make sure that in delivering humanitarian assistance, we don't empower groups labeled as terrorists. We have reporting obligations. We need to put in place certain mechanisms to make sure that whoever is supposed to receive assistance actually receive it, and it's not diverted to others. Again, this takes skills, this takes staff, this takes money. In Somalia, for instance, we have requests to report to the Security Council regularly to make sure that the humanitarian assistance is not being diverted. So we have teams whose sole purpose is to actually look at that. In Syria, because so many member states are involved with so many different rules and so many donors imposing so different rules, we have one OCHA staff dedicated to help the whole humanitarian community navigate the different counterterrorism policies and legislations, just to make sure that we don't violate those. So that's also something that takes resources. Now, this being said, if you look at how much it costs, and I tried to do the costing yesterday, we spend every year, or last year at least, we spend around 700 millions in coordination, telecommunication, and logistics as humanitarians. And that's, of course, a lot of money. But when you look at for what it is 700 million to support 25 billions of programming. So in a sense, this like support function are about 3 to 4% of what we actually need. So it's in absolute term very expensive. In relative term, I think it's pretty cheap if it works, and it's in our interest to make it work. Just to close, maybe on some of the trade-off and business model. First, I don't think there's any magic business model to operate in this kind of environments, at least not on that I've seen. But there are some key principles which we should try to apply in all emergencies. Be close to communities and the needs, meaning really have offices in remote locations, which means have security also in these locations. Remember that the UN doesn't deliver assistance. The UN doesn't deliver assistance. It's not UNHCR or WFP that directly, in most cases, take the assistance and deliver to communities. We partner with local actors. It means that we need to put in place mechanisms in order to make sure that aid is not diverted, that there's a quality control. So that's also quite important. And then invest in coordination. These are very messy environments with hundreds of actors sometimes. If you want assistance to be strategic, if you want it to reach the right people, you need to have a coordination apparatus to support that. So of course I don't want to plead only for OCHA in that case. It's also asking NGOs, asking other UN agencies to invest in their own coordination. For instance, WFP every year invest a lot in logistic clusters. They have logistic clusters in most environments where we operate. This is two. And finally, on the trade-offs, I think in this kind of environment, as Mark said, you always have a suboptimal options, and it's always what are you going to compromise on? I think that's what we're facing. And we need, I think, together to have this understanding that there's no zero risks, and that we need to accept how we're going to manage them, and that we'll never reach the optimum response. And I give you very concrete example: timeliness versus quality of aid and efficiency. In Syria, for instance, we chose to do food airdrops. Very expensive way to distribute food, very inefficient way to distribute food. But at some point, you have this decision to make. Do you want aid to be timely, or do you want to wait for the window to have the perfect response? Obviously, in some cases, you can't, and this is something which has to be discussed with people who finance assistance. Remote management. In some cases, we have to accept that we can't access communities. In Raqqa, for instance, the UN is not present. We still want to deliver assistance, so we need to find partners who accept on our behalf to distribute assistance in this environment. This increases a lot of fiduciary risks. How do we manage that? I mean, this is a risk we have to accept. Short-term versus long-term approaches on access. Very often we are pushed to access communities as soon as possible, sometimes taking armed escort and go for one-off and then come back. and mainly for communication purposes. Maybe we have to accept that we have to have more long-term strategy on access, but that requires an investment. It requires having staff present on the ground for a long time, sometimes with no success, building this relationship. So really these tensions. Last words, maybe general remarks. Cutting costs on analysis, on security, on all the support functions has an impact. It has an impact on the quality of aid. It often has an impact on the security of staff as well. And I think we need to be aware of that. Another thing is that we notice that the organizations best able to navigate those dilemmas and tensions are the ones which receive flexible funding and which are allowed to invest in their staff and competence. Which brings me to another issue, which we're not discussing really here, is what kind of HQ support is needed to deliver in the field. To have an operation in the field, you need to have a minimum apparatus in New York or in Geneva to support that. Building staff skills on access and negotiation, you need to have people at HQ who actually do that for the organizations. Finally, last remarks, where I think this discussion should take us is really to have this dialogue between the states, NGOs, UN agencies on what kind of risks we are ready to accept, how we manage them, and what kind of partnership we want to have. And I'm not talking only about money. I'm talking about, like, are we in this together and do we accept to take some risk and to manage them, or are we at opposite ends, and then it's the question of whether we can even deliver in this kind of environment. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Erlen, for that view from the humanitarian perspective. I think it's something that we're all become aware of, that these highly insecure environments are sort of really the new norm for humanitarian actors, and that has costs. You know, on the costs, actually, we've talked a bit about the new business models, and Annette mentioned the reforms. Mark said, you know, look, it's not always about more money. Something that you said about the supports, that it's, you know, in absolute terms it's expensive, but in relative terms it's actually quite cost effective. I think you can say that about a lot of what we're talking about, actually, that in relative terms this is actually, we're talking about activities that are quite cost effective in the long run. But thank you also for the concrete examples of the food aid in Syria, for example, on trade-offs between timeliness versus efficiency, short-term versus long-term. You mentioned also the counterterrorism, the challenge of operating under the counterterrorism framework. I would just plug IPI has been doing a fair amount of work on this. We just produced a report on that, and I think in looking at what it takes to achieve success in these areas, there's real importance to understand what are the risks of the humanitarian chill, that under all these restrictions that are being imposed, that there's a risk that some humanitarian actors are taking a step back. So it's something to keep in mind. So I recommend that report to you by Alice DeMare, our policy analyst on that issue. We've got plenty of time for Q&A, and so the floor is open.
Missions. The first point is that I can totally underline this point that UN operations are very cost effective, because if you compare UN operations with what national military operations cost and what they often are able to deliver and what the UN is able to deliver, I think the UN is doing an amazing job. Now, few comments. Now, one way of improving the UN's way of doing business would be to do more local procurement. Once I've been told that the troops in northern Mali receive frozen beef from Paraguay, which is not exactly the best way of supplying them. First, it has a high carbon footprint to fly beef all the way half around the world, while there might be local people who could benefit. Of course, this can distort local markets. That's an issue, quality control. Or once an SSG in Somalia said he eats fish, and the fish doesn't come from the ocean nearby on the MIA base, but it comes from Kenya or who knows where. So again, more local procurement. Drinking water. Now, for member states, I think it's key that more money is being invested in transport helicopters and transport planes of all sorts of sizes. Like Nanette mentioned that the airport in Bangui has a short runway. Now in northern Mali, the UN has been building its own runway. So look into extending the runway, improving the runway, maybe building a second runway so that bigger cargo aircraft can touch the ground in Bangui, have more helipads across the ERC so that different types of transport helicopters can get out there. So member states need to invest more, not in some fancy missile defense and submarines and stuff, but in stuff the UN can really use. And my last point is the UN needs to do more in terms of using solar energy, wind energy, treating, better treating and recycling wastewater. Like in Haiti, we had some big problems with wastewater runoff, possibly causing cholera. So there's a lot the UN can do in improving lowering its carbon footprint and increasing its sustainability efforts in the field. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Good suggestions there. We'll take a round of questions before we come back to the panel. Yes, here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Hugh Bainon from UNISDR, UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. Naturally, a question on disaster risk. Just wondering, to what extent do the risk assessments conducted in these very complex environments take disaster risk into account, and the impact of disasters on the ability to deliver, but also the impact of the peacekeeping missions on exacerbating disaster risk, maybe in some situations. I was wondering if you can maybe highlight the extent to which disaster risk is considered, and if not, how it can be potentially integrated more into these kind of risk analysis.
Great. Yes, one more over here.
I am Dr. Gabrielli of the International Organization for Victim Assistance. Just to underline the issue of time, the dimension of time, I totally agree with you, or maybe you didn't quite say that way, that long-term perspective is necessary. That is, including knowing the history of what led to a conflict anywhere. I mean, in a car we make a lot of mistakes by not learning over and over again. So that holding a long-term perspective in principle, not just as a thought, I would think it's absolutely necessary, because otherwise we simply don't learn from our own mistakes. And the other issue I wanted to bring up is that you mentioned NGOs should have, unless I misunderstood you, that NGOs should have their own security arrangements. I can see that as very problematic in terms of lack of coordination, and it could lead to more risk than. I agree that NGOs should feel secure and should take care of their own security, however, must be in coordination with everything else that's going on. Otherwise, a lot of problems can happen.
Thank you. Okay, we'll come back to the panel and then we'll have another round of questions. Mark, why don't we start with you, and free to answer the questions, respond to the panelists.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of thoughts, and I think Nanette and Boyan are better equipped to answer these questions. But on the issue of local procurement, perhaps, I mean, I'm not aware, maybe Nanette does, I'm not aware of the issue of the beef from Guatemala. But I will say this, I mean, again, here's an interesting trade-off. If you're going to do more local procurement, in these places, very few local companies are listed on the UN global list of vendors, where they've been checked and vetted. So you're going to need to vet, because you need to know who you're supplying from. You need to know the connection. It's not just a fiduciary risk issue, it's a reputational risk. So you need to know who these people are. So I, in principle, I fully support the idea, but it will mean that you need to make sure that locally, not at HQ, but locally, you have people with risk management capabilities. And as Aurélien really rightly said, it's money and skills. Risk management, risk analysis is not something that UN has in large supply. These are dedicated, specific skills to look at a vendor. In Somalia, we did a lot of analysis, for example, of private security companies. You know, people like me, people, you know, mostly populate the UN, don't have these skills. That's really a specific competency there. Just quickly on the disaster risk management, again, I think it's my sense is that it's very uneven across the UN. It also, because here you're also talking about the risk to the UN's ability to achieve its strategies, whether it's peacekeeping, humanitarian. So, going back to risk management, we have dedicated units in Afghanistan and Somalia. That's it. And one of the things they do is to look at precisely that, disaster risk management, from the perspective of risk to the UN's objectives in that country. So recently we conducted a drought risk assessment for the UN, looking at the impact that the drought and a famine, if it had been realized, would have on not just on the communities, which is the most important thing, but also on the UN's broader objectives in Somalia. How would that derail the UN's political objectives? How would that derail or impact the UN's development or state building agenda? But also, again, looking at the fact that we're all sources of risk, looking at the impact of the UN and its posture, its strategies, its funding, and so forth, the impact that has on the drought response. So I think these disaster risk assessments need to look at the issue from different perspectives. Thanks.
No, thank you. I mean, just starting off, I really agree with Mark about the issues related to procuring locally. It's also often the markets are very weak, and so they also can barely support the local population as it is. For example, like water in Mali. And so if you have this large peacekeeping operation coming in and wanting to procure locally, you run the risk of driving up prices, pricing it out of the local population's ability to buy. And yes, we also have to take into account the systems contracts for a lot of things, which of course we do because it becomes more efficient and cost effective. But then of course you have to balance that off against the carbon footprint that you're saying. I mean, everything comes with a cost. And yes, I am aware of the issue of the meat. Which I think was addressed later. But on improving the runway in Rainy and having more helipads, again, that comes with money. Many major infrastructure projects are not necessarily seen as the responsibility of peacekeeping, and it is something that we have been able to partner, for example, like with the World Bank in Liberia, in repairing roads in order to ensure that we could undertake our operations and supply troops. And so that's something that we certainly think is a way that we can collectively work together, because it doesn't benefit us. I mean, the local population has access to the roads, has access to markets, can bring their food to markets. So I think when I keep emphasizing that we're all in this together, I think we have to look at it more from that perspective, and then we may be able to address some of what folks may see as more a long-term or infrastructure project. I do believe that, I mean, as you know, there's been a real strong emphasis from DFS and others about using renewable energy, about really addressing the environmental impact of our fuel presences, about the waste management. And so I think that there's been a lot that's been really undertaken, and it's I think it's helpful forums like this also really stress about how important it is. So I'm glad that you mentioned it. I agree that including disasters, it's uneven. I think we're doing better after we've faced certain disasters and the impact that they have on our operations. I think we could always do better, and that's a message that I'll take back, that we should partner better with you. But I think when I was listening to Mark talking about the drought, I also think that when we look at the SG's really emphasis on regional strategies, that will help us to better manage also disasters, because we're going to be looking beyond the borders of where we're sitting to try to look at the interlineages, because disasters are normally, as you know better than I do, don't respect borders. And so I think that that's going to be helpful when we work together as the UN. I mean, we're looking at it from a more conflict prevention one for Central African Republic. The SG has said in his latest report, we're going to look at it from that perspective, that does involve, other issues from the conflict management. So we're trying to test drive that to do better on it. Yes, I think we've learned a lot of lessons in CAR. We've certainly been there and back again too many times, and we really hope that doing a new approach will be able to do better. Thank you.
On the short term versus long term, I was referring to access in particular, and I think that too often we have a tendency to take the easiest, quickest, but very often the least sustainable approach to access in order to have quick results, instead of investing in longer term approach, which require more resources, which are more costly, and for which results would be more sustainable, but which will take longer. So that, I think that was my point, but what you said applies also to the response, to the humanitarian response. If you take, for instance, typically in the case of internal displacement, how we respond as humanitarians, generally you have IDPs in a camp or in an urban setting, and year after year we just repeat the same response, maybe improve a little, but without really a long-term approach and an exit strategy. And actually that's one of the reasons of the soaring price of humanitarian assistance today. It's this protracted crisis that we don't manage to solve. The humanitarian response is not the only factor. There's also a lack of solutions to conflict and others, but it's definitely on your question on NGOs and security. I mean, first to say that humanitarians fall under UNDSS umbrella for security, but more and more they're also building their own security expertise and send their own security advisors. One of the reasons is because of the lack of investment in UNDSS and the need to have security officers where we operate. When it comes to NGOs, I mean, I agree with you, we need to coordinate with them, and we coordinate, and that, but they don't want to be part of the UN system and under the UN umbrella. They don't want to be ruled by an established GE or by UNDSS rules, and this is very right. I mean, the independent organization, who are we to judge? This being said, to have this coordinated approach that you called for, here again, we need to invest. So we put together an initiative with NGO called Saving Lives Together, and we have then set also an organization called INSO, which is International Network for Security of NGOs, which is exactly that. It's how, without having NGOs under the UN, how we help them build their own capacity to manage their security and to communicate with us on these security issues. But again, that's an investment we make.
Excellent, thanks. The floor is open again. I know we've got one here in the front, Hirsch. And several in the back.
John Hirsch, I'm with IPI. I'd like to ask you, each of you, to say your definition of the word success. Success. At least Adam and maybe one of you used them. Strikes me that this long list that you had on one of the early PowerPoints, where you listed all these countries that are doing very badly, that these have been going on for at least a decade, maybe even longer. On the other hand, you have certain countries, I'm thinking of Namibia and Botswana, that are not in this problem at all. So, that are managing themselves in a fairly democratic and responsible way. So, I kind of understand your points about wanting to be efficient, but are you talking about sort of like the next 10, 20 years you foresee being in these countries that you have listed? So it's not solving the conflict, it's simply financing the management of the conflict. So how does one get to a point where you no longer have to be there at all?
We've got all the way standing in the back there.
Thank you. Cornelia Walter, I've been over the past 18 years in 5 of the high-risk countries that you had on your very interesting presentation. I would like to establish a bridge to the very interesting presentation and panel discussion that you had IPI last week on the rules of restraint. Because I think the big bulk of investments in security is related to the protection and to keeping the varying parties away from us, but maybe it would be worth considering to invest a bit more thinking and understanding into shaping their behavior towards us. And that maybe comes also back to weighing in certain circumstances, Afghanistan for example, on when it might be worth refraining from political interventions because they endanger the humanitarian side of the UN? Thank you.
Great, thanks. And we've got, I think, well, a question from social media here. Oh, no? No? Oh, okay.
Hi, this is just a question from you. I'm Annie
Oh,
from
sorry, okay.
To what extent is the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse integrated into this risk management?
Great, thanks. And let's do one more all the way in the back, and then we'll come back.
Thanks a lot, Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I saw the slide about Somalia, the various projects, so I had to run over here and ask. I wanted to ask, I have questions for, I guess, two of the panelists. One has to do with, in Somalia, there was this Board of Audit, I guess, expose of cost overruns in air supply and rations, and I just, at least to my knowledge, I never know what actually happened with that, and I'm wondering if you had those projects listed, if you knew. And on CAR, maybe more kind of impacting the public there was this dump, I guess Kalango was its name, there was a dump that UN's waste was going into, and I know, having seen the documents, that some of it has resulted in malaria. There were a lot of complaints by people, and SRSG had said that somehow it was misunderstood and that it was all being addressed. But I guess in putting the two together, I just wondered in terms of this presentation, what I thought when you said the downsides were going to be that it's difficult to not have these type of things happen. But could you say a little bit more about what's being done to make sure that, you know, not just that you vet local contractors. I think in the Somalia case, it was not a local contractor. And I think in the CAR case, are you aware of that dump and what's actually been done since the documents came out about it? Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Should we go reverse order? Okay.
Thank you very much. First, what do I call success? I call success relative. I think it really depends on the context and what is your goal. And here I speak really as a humanitarian. And in some cases, just delivering the minimum assistance needed to a community can be success. I took the example of food airdrop in Syria. I think in that case it was a success because we had communities who had not received anything for several months, and that was really a survival issue at that point. So in a way, that people survived thanks to our assistance, that's a success. In other contexts, clearly this is not enough. We need to go much beyond that. In CAR, for instance, I think we can do better in some areas of CAR than just distributing minimum humanitarian assistance. I think we need to partner with our development colleagues. I think we need to work closer with the mission in order to offer other perspectives to these poor people who are trapped in a conflict. So really, I think the success depends on which context you speak about and at which point in the conflict you are, from a humanitarian perspective. Then on two things on investing in shaping the behavior of what is the conflict, if I understand well. First, yes, I absolutely agree, and we work quite closely with several organizations, one of them being Geneva Call, to actually have this dialogue with armed groups on what is our role, what are their obligations, how we can connect to each other. But I think the best way to shape the behavior of parties to conflict in a context as humanitarians is to really look at your own behavior first and make sure you can't be accused of taking sides. Namely, abide by humanitarian principles. And that sounds maybe theoretical, but I'm not saying it. This is what we hear from armed groups themselves. There's an interesting article from Geneva Call called In Their Words, which look at different armed groups and what they think about humanitarians. And the primary point they make is we want humanitarians who are neutral and just want to serve people. We don't want people involved in some political activities on our territory. But that again, to reach that point, there's another study by OCHA which shows that humanitarian organizations don't really invest in building their staff skills in terms of abiding by humanitarian principles and navigating the dilemmas you face on the day-to-day in operations in respecting those principles. So again, that's an investment on our side. And finally on PSCA, BISC, which is a coordination body for humanitarians, has made several statements on its determination to really tackle this issue, and just created a fund which will basically be used to prevent PSCA and assist the victims of PSCA when unfortunately this happens. So indeed there is an investment also on this aspect, and the idea is really to manage risk, both the risk of PSCA and the reputational risks associated with the occurrence of PSCA.
You know, I should say the reference to the event that we had last week on roots of restraint was a launch with the ICRC on their new report on roots of restraint in war, and the video of the event is now online, so please check it out. But it's really a fascinating study in looking at the reasons or how you can, depending upon the structure of the armed group, whether it's a hierarchical force or a network-based group, to understand why it is they do or do not behave in such a way. And one of the encouraging things for me that came out of that conversation was their determination is that engagement and training actually do work.
Great, thank you. So, definition of success. I think for a peacekeeping operation, it may be a little easier in the mandate to define sort of success. But then, of course, you always have different analysis as to when you have reached that success. And it's something that we had a lot of discussions with council members with respect to the closure of UOC and Hunmill. And there was a lot of different views as to whether it was too early, too late. The same with the DRC, there was questions, should we have it early or late? And I think that they will also always have that question. I think the bottom line for us is that success of a peacekeeping operation does not necessarily mean that all the problems in the country are solved. When you were deployed for very specific reasons, and those are the reasons we need to focus on so we can get out. We were never meant to be, in countries long term, except for the frozen conflicts, of course, where we have a role to play. So I'm one of the peacekeepers who believe that we really need to get in, do the job, and then hand over to those who will have the long-term responsibilities, and in that way sort of move away from, as you were saying, financing the management of the conflict to financing, if I may say, financing peace. And so whether it's 10 or 20 years, it really depends on the context. But once we have addressed it, and the country itself can resolve differences of views or conflicts peacefully or through constitutional means, that's great. Then the development, or when there's pockets of humanitarian, concerns, that should be addressed by bilateral and UN partners. But it's always a discussion as to when the success has been achieved. On integrating SEA into risk management, absolutely. And that's something we look at as well. Like I was talking about the temporary operating bases. How many soldiers should be there in order to ensure appropriate command and control. Are there risks that their senior commanders are not present enough or not visiting them enough? And so yes, it's absolutely something that we look at in the different aspects of the mission's implementation of its mandate. That was just one example. On the roots of restraints, investing more in shaping the behavior of armed groups. I think that's what we do as part of our mandates, as part of our approach in working with local communities. I mentioned our community liaison assistants, which play a really important role of bringing us closer together and knowing the dynamics, because with some armed groups, when they're inextricably linked with the communities, and so you do have to work very closely with them and with the communities in order to shape their behavior. For example, like we're looking at for CAR, one of the we had some folks out there who were looking a lot at this, and also the local security arrangements, which requires those dynamics. And they were saying that they really welcomed the community violence reduction projects, more so than anything else, because they felt like they got this really benefit from them, and then also the community got a benefit. So I think we have to look at that sort of connection. But I unfortunately couldn't make your interesting meeting on that. But if I may say something a little bit provocative about to refrain from political engagement because that could negatively impact humanitarian response. You know, if the requirement for humanitarian response stems from a political breakdown or a security breakdown, I think that you need to address the political problems that are shaping the country so that the humanitarian assistance has an exit strategy, so that you can move towards, you know, development. And so that's my view. I think that you should address the problems that are there, and you should find the most sustainable solution, even if the solution is maybe not the one that's most immediate. On the Colombo waste management, I'd have to get back to you on that. I don't have all the details, but I will do so, and then maybe we can be in touch on it. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'll just just a few of those questions. I mean, on success, I think we have enough evidence to show how dangerous it is to claim success or mission accomplished. I just happen also to be under, a dual citizen of two countries that are going through significant social stress, and you would have thought about that 2 years ago. So I think we need to be very careful with any definition of success. I also think it's not a one point in time, or it's more of a continuum along the lines of what Nanette said. And I'm also on this kind of from the Ian Martin school of thought, where it's more defined as when there is sufficient time and space in any given country for people to figure out their own problems, but without minimal interference and support. That to me gets closer to some type of definition of success, the notion of giving them time and space, and when that's in place. On the SCA, yes, I mean every agency, missions, but also UN agencies have SCA in their risk management frameworks, and that can be looked at agency by agency, mission by mission, or UN system-wide in any given country. But I think the positive news is that it's much more integrated now in our respective and collective risk management approaches. On the issue of Somalia, I don't have the details on the Board of Auditors and the project overrun, but I will say this. I think, first of all, we know that a lot of stuff happened in 2011 with the famine. We know there was aid diversion. This is why there was a significant effort on the part of the UN and other partners to increase their risk management capabilities. This is the type of environment when you have competing objectives of having to deliver fast, deliver at scale, deliver with little knowledge and little presence on the ground, stuff happens. That's the reality. And so that's the whole point of investing in these systems, risk management systems, presence, security, to mitigate against these risks of stuff happening, aid being either lost or diverted. And it happened during the famine. And I think what's positive there is that since then, in a place like Somalia, a number of UN entities have significantly strengthened their systems to avoid those types of mistakes. And so I think, when you had the response to the drought 2 years ago, a lot of cash also being dispersed across Somalia, and I think with a much lower probability of incidents like what we saw back in 2011, again speaking to the value of investing in some of these systems. But also remember, when you do invest in these systems to find out more, you will find out more. And donors, member states, media need to be ready for it and accept that the more we invest in these systems in some of these places, in the beginning, the more we're going to know and find out, because that's the reality in the field. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
People have been benefited by this trade-offs.
Okay. One more question from the floor at all before we? That's right. Okay, easy. One quick, very concise question, and then you can also provide any final remarks if you like. Measuring the impact of trade-offs.
That's an easy one. No, I think in a way for us it's pretty clear. I mean, you have needs assessed. You have to address this need. Measuring the impact is measuring how many of these needs have been met or not. I think that's the bottom line. And and what you try to do is to navigate these very complex environments and play with trade-offs so as to make sure that you end up as close to the target as possible. I think that's how we try to navigate the trade-off. Experience from other contexts, other past experiences also help. We know that some things don't work. We know that, for instance, when you use armed escorts in certain environments, it becomes extremely complex in the long term to build a relationship with communities and address needs and get acceptance for armed groups. So that's how we try to navigate the trade-off. For me, as final remarks, if I had one message, I think is we need here in New York a bit detached from some of the field realities. I would like us to realize all together that there's no zero risk in this environment. There's no zero risk. These are very messy contexts. And if we want to operate, if we want to perform in these environments, we need to accept to manage these risks. And we need to put in place the systems needed to manage these risks, and we need to invest in these systems. And I'm not sure we're there yet. And we need to accept that failure can happen in these environments. That's also accepting parts of the risks. PSEA can happen, data version can happen, other stuff can happen, staff can be killed. That's in a way a failure. It can happen in this risk. The challenge for us is to manage risks so as to minimize them to the minimum.
Thank you. I don't think there's one way to measure the impact of the trade-offs. I sort of mentioned some, like helping save some children in a village. That then you can have show and also demonstrate the presence of the state or how the state is helping. How do you measure that? But it is something that can help stabilize an area. So I guess in the end, I would say that the measurement, does this take us further in the implementation of our mandate? Does this take us, the country, the UN, peacekeeping closer to achieving our strategic objective? Does it help create the conditions for a successful political process? Does it prevent civilians from being killed? So it's different questions that you ask each time that you're looking at the trade-off. And I think sometimes what we have difficulty conveying here are how you measure the impact and the benefits. We sort of feel it, or our colleagues on the ground feel it, and they instinctively know. And they know the environment, and they know how to take the mandate forward or to help the country. So it's not one thing. It's not whether you say 5 people or 10 people. So I would say that it's a constant evaluation. I mean, we are trying to improve how we as peacekeeping measure our performance, which is also measuring the impact. We have this comprehensive performance assessment system, and MINUSCA is one of peacekeeping operations that's doing the pilot project. So hopefully maybe a year from now we'll have a better answer for you. We're quite excited about this project, and so we hope it will take us further. So I guess in conclusion, I would completely agree with you. What is the risk of failure? What is the cost of failure, in my mind as well? Or what is the cost of not being present? I mean, a lot of times people look at MINUSCA and see how difficult it is, and how difficult it is in part, and how many times we tried. But what if we weren't present? I think the cost of not being present, or the cost of failure, is much higher than I think the international community or people of the country can accept. So I think we have to think about it that way. But I also think we always have to think about our exit strategy, and not just as peacekeeping, whose exit should come earlier than others. But as engaged as the international community, I think I completely agree with Mark. It's like, when can a country solve its problems within constitutionally mandated needs? When can they have conflict or differences of views and manage it themselves without us supporting them, whether the humanitarian implications of it, or deciding on development projects, or peace and security? So I think that we always have to have that in our mind and our sights. And so I think in that way we can actually see what are the trade-offs and what are the risks, and to see that it's worth it. Thank you.
Thanks very briefly.
Yeah, I think on measuring the trade-offs, I would agree it's very context specific. I think the difficulty with this issue, and in a way that's why we thank IPI for organizing this, is that if you don't define what you're talking about, it can remain at the level of theology, and it's not that impactful. So it's got to be very context specific, very issue specific. So again, I would thank IPI and the government of Sweden. I would just say as a concluding remark, I think for us, I mean, many of you have served in these places. You probably agree that this matters to people, to our colleagues in the field, to our colleagues in the UN, in the NGO world, in the delegations. This matters. Getting inside these details, understanding the costs, understanding these things. The words that are uttered here, the words that are written in a mandate or in a budget report, they matter. They have implications on people's lives. Obviously, the populations in these countries, but also our colleagues who are out there and expecting us to keep that in mind when we attend meetings and write reports. So we would really encourage continuation of this dialogue because it's not academic. It matters to our colleagues and friends in the field. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And now we will move to closing remarks by Ambassador Rina Shulgin-Mignoni. Yes, please, to the panel. Deputy Permanent Representative Sweden. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this, Adam and all the staff at the IPI. I would say that, I mean, of course, we are, as Sweden, extremely pleased with all our collaboration with IPI. We're very happy that you organized this meeting, and thank you especially to the panelists for your very knowledgeable and interesting interventions and the way that you respond to questions. I think it's extremely interesting. I wish we had more of this type of discussions in the Security Council. I think maybe 3 quick takeaways, I think, from this is really that, I mean, it's obvious that we are discussing very complex realities on the ground, and how to manage them, and how to look at risks, and how that links to how mandates are being formulated, and the costs around what should security cost, and what can it be allowed to cost. I think it's almost impossible to answer, but I think it's nevertheless extremely important to have that discussion, and also the very equally difficult but necessary discussion about trade-offs. I just note that when we talk about these things, I noticed that Mark was mentioning that sometimes this becomes very technical and complex, but that is what the reality looks like. It is complex and it has to be technical, and I think that sometimes it is difficult to explain, but we have to try. Or I would plead to you to try even more to really find ways to really explain these things, perhaps especially to the members of the Security Council who are sitting with the mandate formulations, but also to colleagues in the Fifth Committee who are then juggling dollars in a way that I think sometimes is very unrealistic. So I think it's true that we often here in New York also need to take decisions that are based on other, more political, considerations. So they're motivated by other politics and the politics that are the realities on the ground. But then at least let us try to make sure that we are taking as informed decision as possible. So even if we are not taking the right decision, at least we're aware of it. I think that is important. And then again, I think the issue of the trade-offs comes in, and really the importance of telling here in New York to really tell us, the member states, what we need to hear, not what we want to hear. And I think that is worth repeating, that sometimes we tend to do too much self-censorship in this place in New York, and I think we need to get away from that more. I think the 2 years that we have now been in the Security Council, I would say that one of the sort of best reminders almost of this is when we have a lot of blue helmets in the chamber, in the council. It doesn't happen very often. It's strangely enough. And we keep on having a lot of good briefers, but sometimes I think we need to have more of the reality on the ground being shared in the Security Council chamber and also in our close consultations. I think you often see that we have experts that discuss this more in detail, but then when you come to the sort of DPR and PR level, very rarely that happens. And I think it would be useful to have more of that. I think one process that actually helped in a sense was this whole discussions around the A4P, where I think actually the process in itself was just as useful as the final document, and the how we take that forward is going to be, I think, helpful in answering some of these challenges that you mentioned. I just note also that several of you mentioned that we are in this together. That is very true. We are indeed. And that also, I think, demands something from all of us, and I think that is really to actually be more clear on what those demands are on each other, and to look at how can we do that more, how can we do that better. And I also noticed specifically the question that was raised, or the comment that you raised about looking into, how much risk are we really willing to take. That is also part of the reality of today, unfortunately. That high risks comes at a high cost, not only financially, but actually in human lives. And I think, again, far away from the field in many ways here in New York, but it doesn't have to be like that in so many of our discussions. And I'm lucky that I have served in UN missions, and therefore I think maybe for me it's in a way more striking how little many of my colleagues know about this reality. I'm not saying this to sort of promote my CV, but just to say that actually I do hear what you say, and I really agree that there is a need to find ways of speaking more openly and more informative, and maybe with a little bit more of pedagogy. Is that an English word? Pedagogy with us member states here in New York. So this is one very good example of that you're having this debate, you're having these discussions, and we raise these difficult questions. And I just encourage you to continue, and I will obviously be able to ensure you that from the mission of Sweden, we will be very happy to continue and to do whatever we can to also broaden this discussion and involve more of our colleagues from the different member states as we go. So thank you so much.